Hello, this is another video I wanted to do on the Old Testament, but it's a break from what I've been doing where I've discussed a book each time. This time I wanted to discuss the general topic of literacy in ancient Israel and how that does apply to the subject of when the books of the Old Testament were written. Let me share my screen. Okay, literacy in ancient Israel. That's a picture of a painting of the scribe Baruch. This verse was always interesting to me. In the story of Gideon, it's an interesting story, but this is the part of the story which people tend to usually forget about when there's just a pursuit going on. Gideon and his men are pursuing the enemy, and then there's this verse. It says, "And he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men." So this is not an elite person that did this writing. This was some random young soldier who couldn't keep up with the people who were retreating. But whoever that person was, he was able to write. And Gideon and the folks with him were able to read the names of 77 men. And this happened before 1000 BC. Now, when we use the Bible to argue for something, someone who might be skeptical about the Bible might rightly say that the Bible is trying to argue a certain case for something. And that's valid. You know, the Bible is trying to make a case for the law of the Lord and the commitment to Christ in the New Testament and that sort of thing. But what the Bible is not actually doing is they were not trying to trick people into thinking that they were more literate than they really were. So when we read a verse that talks about people writing, that's kind of a good evidence that people really could write. It's not the sort of thing that anybody would be deceptive about, I don't think. So how literate do we think that people really were at the time of the Bible? This verse in Isaiah is interesting, but it may not be very illuminating. Isaiah says, "And the vision of all this has become to you like the words of a book that is sealed. When men give it to one who can read, saying, 'Read this,' he says, 'I can't because it's sealed.' And when they give the book to one who cannot read, saying, 'Read this,' and he says, 'I can't read.'" So the point is, some people at the time of Isaiah could read and some people could not. But that doesn't tell us anything at all because that would be true even today. We don't know what percentage is in which category. Now, almost everything I've seen about literacy in ancient Israel reflects sort of a conventional wisdom that the literacy level was very low, that very few people could read or write. The estimates seem to range from some low, I call 10 to 15%, to very low, 0.3%, that'd be less than 1%. However, that conventional wisdom is everywhere I've read about it, it's just based on an analogy to the Middle Ages, the way things were in the Middle Ages when literacy was very low in the Western world, and to modern tendencies. Modern tendencies is that agrarian societies have low literacy. And since ancient Israel was mostly agrarian, therefore the literacy level must have been also very low. But I'm not sure that taking into account what we really have as far as internal evidence from that time. The belief that literacy might have been very low may also have affected people's views on when the books were written. If you have looked at any of my other videos, you have seen that in most cases I have tended to suggest that books were written at the earlier stage of when people sometimes think that they were. And so because people think literacy was low, they might argue that most people couldn't really write back then. But I think that maybe the literacy level was higher than that. And I want to offer a few lines of reasoning for that. First of all, it's just the number of books. These are 39 books in the Old Testament. Some cases you had the same person write more than one, but in a number of cases, you've got one book which had actually multiple authors writing into the book. So there were kind of a lot of people writing. And of course, these are just the books that are preserved. It doesn't tell us anything at all about other things that were written which were not preserved. In addition to the Old Testament, you have the Apocrypha, books written before the time of Christ. They're present in a Catholic or an Orthodox Bible. The Apocrypha mentions some other books which are lost to us now. And the Bible mentions other books which are lost to us now. A few of those books, like if you look down the list, the book of Samuel the seer, that may have found its way into the our book of Samuel. But most of those books in the list are books which were written once upon a time and we don't have them anymore. Or we could talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have all the books of the Bible, or most all the books of the Bible represented. And they have many commentaries on books of the Bible and many books that are based on the Bible, books like Jubilees. They have rule books, and they have books about apocalyptic things like the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And overall, they've got more than 800 different writings of various kinds other than just the books on the Bible. And this is just the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is not the center of Israel proper. It's just a rather obscure sect down in the Judean desert. But they still had a lot of books. Or we could look at something close to Israel, the library in Ugarit. That's in northern, far north of Lebanon there. But as you can see on this map, Ugarit is up near the top, a little bit north of where Israel today. And in that library, they have about 1,500 texts and fragments, and it's written in a language quite similar to Hebrew. And it was about 12th or 13th century BC. So it would be about the time of the judges in the Bible. And they have so many texts there that they have a full library. Would we expect that everything that they had was preserved? Not at all. You'd expect almost everything to be destroyed, and yet enough was preserved to make up a veritable library, both there and with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, of making many books, there is no end. So in this time when ostensibly the literacy wasn't very high, there were many, many books, which is interesting to think of. Who actually is supposed to write according to the Bible? Well, Moses is told to write, and a number of times you might have other people who you'd expect to be writers, like prophets and whatnot. But in addition to all the most obvious people like that, you have the priest is supposed to write something, whoever that priest happens to be. Anybody who obeys the Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, because you shall write the laws on the doorpost of your house. And anybody who's obeying it is supposed to write. Every king is supposed to write a copy of a Torah scroll when he goes up to sit on his throne for the first time. Anybody who wants a divorce is supposed to write. The land surveyors are supposed to write in Joshua. Isaiah mentions a child can write, and anybody in the New Testament parable of who owed money to an unjust steward was supposed to be able to write down how much they owed. So a lot of different people are supposed to write or be expected to be able to do that. And then back to the subject of what would we expect to see preserved? Well, the answer is not very much. In ancient Israel, the main thing that they would write on were scrolls, and scrolls are made out of animal skin, and animal skin degrades. So you just wouldn't expect anything that's thousands of years old to last. But yet we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's a fluke. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this is a fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll, and while some of the scrolls are pretty well preserved, most of them look kind of like this, where they're torn into little bits. And the reason is because an animal skin will decay over time. But the Dead Sea Scrolls did better because in the Dead Sea area, that's a place which has extraordinarily low humidity, and they were stored in caved and sealed in ceramic pots. And because of that, they had the ability that some of them actually survived, but that's very much the exception. About the only thing that you can normally expect to survive would be something written in stone, like the Siloam inscription, but very few people, that's in the Hezekiah's tunnel, but very few people would write anything in stone. There are a number of cases where there are ostracons, and that would be if somebody wrote something on pottery. This is a picture of an ostracon called the Yavne Yam ostracon. The writer here is complaining about someone who stole his cloak and he wants it back. Or you could look at the Arad letters. Those were letters written from Arad in Judah about 600 BC, probably when Josiah was the king. Arad is not a bustling metropolis now or then, but they found about 200 ostracon there. And it seemed to be a military garrison there, but it's not a big garrison, only about 20 or 30 soldiers. And they did a computer study of the writing and determined that there were at least 12 different authors. So there are kind of a lot of people writing. And I don't know how elite you would say a group of soldiers was that are at a particular garrison, a little bit in and out of the way area, but a number of them could write. Here's an example of the sort of thing they're writing. A soldier is writing about how you need to send a message to someone warning them because there's a danger that Edom might come, Edom being an enemy of Judah at that time. Let's talk about the New Testament, because I think the situation is similar in the New Testament, and in a way we can say even a little bit more, I think, about the literacy in the New Testament. This is 27 books in the New Testament. How about this passage where it says Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus from Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription. Well, so Pilate wrote something, and the reason he wrote was because he thought people could read it. I think if less than 1% of the people out there could read, there wouldn't have been much point in writing an inscription. But he wrote it because he knew people could read. And it said many people did read. And it says it was written in not just one language, but three: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. This is the English Standard Version, and the word that's translated Aramaic is Hebraisti, which may be problematic. It might be a little bit better to say Hebrew, but that's kind of a different subject. The point is that the governor wrote because he thought a lot of people could read it, and a lot of people did. What about Jesus's disciples, just sort of as a random sampling group? I realize this isn't a completely random group of folks, but what can we say about their level of literacy? Well, Jesus, we know that he could read and write. This is a passage about him reading a scroll in the synagogue. But of course, this is Jesus, so maybe that may not be a fair person to pick. But then you can say Matthew, he wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Of course, Matthew was a tax collector, which might be a job which entailed writing. But John was a fisherman, and John has several books that are normally assigned to him. And Peter was another fisherman. And so Peter has books that are assigned to him. I realize not everybody would agree that maybe John and Peter were the actual authors of those, but it's sort of beside the point. Somebody wrote them, and so somebody could read, and the people they wrote to somebody could write, and the people they wrote to could read. And so there you have, if that's 13 people, Jesus and 12 disciples, you've got 4 of them that could write. Plus, really, Andrew's the brother of Peter and James is the brother of John. You'd think that if one brother could write, the other probably could too. And it sure doesn't mean that the other ones that are still not highlighted there could not write or read. It's just we don't know about them. We know about all the ones that are in red. So it seems like that's a lot of people who could read and write. And so Philip, now this, I want to include this about Philip. This is actually not the same Philip, but there is a passage in Acts that talks about Philip, the evangelist, and he's reading, this is a story about an Ethiopian eunuch returning from Jerusalem. He's sitting in his chariot and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit says to Philip, go over and join this chariot. So Philip runs up to him and hears him reading. And so anyway, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch can also read. And then there's this thing that Jesus says. He says it 5 times. He says, have you not read? He's criticizing his audience if they're asking him questions, because he's suggesting that they needed to have read something in the Torah, but it's a rhetorical question. When he says, have you not read? The idea is, of course you have read. So really, the implication is the people who are listening to Jesus are also literate. In Luke 1, the very first verse says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of things that have been accomplished among us. So Luke is saying, I'm not the first one to write the things that Jesus did. He says there were many who did it before me. Now we only have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John preserved as gospels, but Luke is telling us that there's lots of people before he ever wrote his gospel. There's lots of other people who made some effort at writing down the things that Jesus did. Now I wanted to tell a little bit of a personal story to kind of illustrate part of what I'm talking about. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to go to the Republic of Georgia. And so I made some effort before I went there to try to learn a little bit of the Georgian language. And lo and behold, it was completely unlike any language family that I had any experience with at all. It had an alphabet which had 33 characters, none of them looked at all familiar. So I made an effort to learn the alphabet, first of all, and then some other things about Georgian. And I did learn the alphabet. It took me about a week or 2. Now, the problem was, once I learned the alphabet, I was still a total beginner because I didn't speak Georgian. All the alphabet allowed me to do was to sound it out. However, someone who already spoke Georgian, if they learn the alphabet, then what that means in a week or 2, they were literate. They could read. And so while I couldn't master Georgian in a week or 2, I could only get the alphabet. Someone who already spoke the language, if they learned the alphabet, they could read. So basic literacy involves learning an alphabet. If someone in ancient Israel learned the Hebrew alphabet, they were then literate. And it's not a very high barrier. They didn't have 33 letters, they only had 22. And if they learned the letters and then they used it or read from time to time, they would have a rudimentary level of literacy. So that is actually not a high barrier in a culture to have a literate culture. Everybody just has to learn the alphabet, and there has to be some basic utilization of the alphabet. Usage is the barrier. If somebody learns an alphabet and then never uses it, then you will be like I am with Georgian, because I've forgotten that alphabet, because I haven't spoken or haven't used it since several years ago. But if someone learns the alphabet and uses it, then a society can be literate. So I like to suggest that literacy in the biblical period was higher than is usually thought. It might be a useful field of future study because I'm not sure this has been very thoroughly investigated. Only thing that I know of is that people have written about how they think the literacy was low, but they're only just making an analogy to modern culture. I don't think it's been really thoroughly investigated. And I can't say that I have investigated it really thoroughly too, or that I'm an expert on the area. I just have made these impressions based on what I've read. Anyway, if you think that literacy was a little bit higher, then there shouldn't be any issue with biblical figures writing books kind of at an earlier date. So that's this topic for my series on dating the Old Testament. I'll be back soon with another video, and it will be, instead of on a general topic like literacy, it will be on another book in the Bible. Thanks for watching.